Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. I am your host, Aaron Erber. This is a podcast about stories, myths, and the Catholic faith. Welcome everybody to I Might Believe in Fairies. I have as a special guest today, Dr. Robert Miller. And I'm going to let Robert explain who he is and what he's doing and what his research interests are and kind of introduce the topic for today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Dr. Bob Miller, and I'm a professor of Old Testament at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and my field is all areas of the Old Testament, but especially mythology. And we're going to define what that means. And in particular, dragons. So dragons in the Old Testament, which people may not even know there are any.
Yeah, so you wrote a book, and the reason I wanted to have you on is because I read your book. I had to get it from the library. But it's called The Dragon, the Mountain, and the Nations. And I thought it was a little beyond me in terms of like the amount of research you put into it. But it was fascinating because it was about dragons, especially dragons in Near Eastern ancient mythological systems with a special focus on the Old Testament and Scripture generally. And yeah, it was really cool. So I'm going to let you define. So a lot of people have a lot of modern people have issues with the word myth. And, if anybody has read Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, they'll know that a myth doesn't just mean something made up or false. So if you could give us, a definition, maybe an academic definition of what a myth is, and then we'll go into your book.
Yeah, I've got sort of the long definition and the short one, and even the long one is pretty short. So the one line is a story that describes what is beyond the world in terms of the world. Now, I have to unpack that with the long. So a story well, let me sort of back up here. Almost every one of these pieces I'm going to have to qualify. So we're going to first say a traditional story about characters that are more than human, set in remote antiquity, that tells us about fundamental values. But you have to qualify all of this stuff. So first of all, story. There are no stories in the mythology of ancient Egypt. You have visual images, and you can imagine a story based on the images, but there's no narrative. So a myth doesn't have to be a narrative. A myth could be just appear in prayers. A myth could appear just in iconography or poetry. So I allow broadly when I say story. By traditional, I mean it's not the private possession of a real small group of people or one author. It's something that has been handed down over time. It doesn't have to be about gods, but the characters have to be somehow more than just human, at least supernatural in some way. It's set in remote antiquity, or at least set in a time where things happen that can't happen now, even if they envision it as, a given period that's not the origin of the universe. It's set in a time where things happen that things can't happen now. And then finally, it is somehow about philosophy. It's about basic right and wrong. It's about why the world is the way it is. These value concepts, and it uses this narrative, this story, in order to get at those instead of philosophy. So a traditional narrative characters more than human, set in the remote past, that is about values.
It's kind of like they're like a narrative worldview, like a worldview set into a narrative. That's kind of and so it's not something that's not true. It's something that's, I've heard the phrase truer than true, or it's like a worldview kind of built into a narrative, like a story,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, for most of the people that have the myth, it's the most true thing that they have.
Right.
Sometimes they believe it may have literally happened. Often they don't really care. And the point is figurative.
Okay. And then, so your book, what kind of research are you primarily interested in, and what prompted you to write your book, and what's kind of the main focus of your book?
Yeah, this book started sort of in the middle because I wanted to write about the appearance in some of the Psalms, especially, of references to God crushing the heads of a sea serpent. And it comes up a few times in some of the Psalms. It comes up in Isaiah 27 and a couple of other places. And I wanted to trace it backwards in time, because scholars have known for a long time that this is an image, a metaphor, a myth that the Israelites borrowed from their neighbors and people before them. And then I just kept tracing it further and further and further back until I got to about 8,000 BC. And I also then traced it forward because I wanted to see what happens to this image in the New Testament. And so I traced it forward into the New Testament as well in the book of Revelation and in various other different places. And the point was not just, because I thought this would be neat to know the history. It's because I think that that to understand these texts, you have to sort of know where they're coming from, and you have to know the roots that go into it. And that it, as much as is a free creation of the authors are building on earlier material, and their meaning is building on earlier meaning. And sometimes you very curiously have elements that have disappeared for thousands of years suddenly reappearing in a myth in a way that proves to me that when you see a little bit of an image, they're actually presupposing the whole of this myth behind them.
You have this image that you kind of spell out in the book that you kind of compare to the ancient Eastern mythologies of Israel's neighbors. And so if you want to, so is that what a mytheme is? Is it kind of like this not prepackaged, but this set of images like that?
Yeah, the mythemes are the images. Okay. So, if you were talking about like language, they have these morphemes and phonemes and things like this. And so this is not a term I coined. I think it was Claude Lévi-Strauss that coined this term mytheme. So in this myth, there's various elements. You have a god who is associated with the storm, who is fighting against a dragon that is also associated with the sea, and he's initially unsuccessful and then is successful later on. And then it goes on to include the mountain where there's some sort of celebratory feast afterwards. But each of these little pieces, so the god is a storm god. That's one mytheme. The storm god is depicted as a bull. That's another mytheme. The dragon is the sea. That's another mytheme. And sometimes some of these things disappear, and sometimes some of these things reappear. So the best example I can think of is that the number of heads that the dragon has is 7 in the Canaanite mythology that the Israelites borrow from. And the 7 heads are completely missing in most of the early Israelite material, and but then suddenly, very late in the history of Israel, you suddenly get the seven heads again, and they're there in the book of Revelation in the early Christian period. And so the mytheme of the seven heads is missing in Psalms and Isaiah and everywhere else in between, and then pops up again. And I kept finding this with many of the mythemes. If they disappeared for a while, they'd come back. And rarely did you have all of them at once. But I needed something other than motif, because motif, scholars have used this in far too many ways. And so I use this word mytheme instead.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think in one chapter you talked about Zeus fighting Typhon, and Typhon, he had snake heads coming out of his shoulders. Is that right? Instead of like seven heads, right. He had, so it gets kind of mixed up, or they change a little bit here and there, but depending on the myth. But it's still the same. And Zeus is also a fertility storm god, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Zeus is an interesting example because it solved a problem for me of how to talk about ways in which people borrow other people's myths.
Yeah.
Because there's different ways that this happens. And so I actually started borrowing terminology from comparative linguistics. So here's the example that will show exactly what I'm talking about. So there's this rule in linguistics that words that had a T in them in Latin become TH in Germanic languages like English. So the Latin word for three is tertius, and it became three in English a long time ago, centuries ago. Later on in time, English borrowed words from French and didn't change the consonant. And so you end up with, in English, you have two different words that mean thin. You've got thin, where the T of tenuis in Latin has turned to th, and then you have the word tenuous, which just means thin, where the T has not changed. It's still t, because one was borrowed thousands of years ago and the other was borrowed hundreds of years ago. And that's exactly what happened in Israel. They borrowed the dragon slaying myth at least 3 times. So they borrowed the myth early on from the Canaanites, who had a storm god Baal that fights against a dragon with 7 heads. And they borrowed that early in their history. Then when the Jews are in exile in Babylon in like the 6th century BC, they were exposed to a Babylonian story about a dragon slaying. The dragon is named Tiamat, and they borrowed it again. And then centuries later, they were exposed to the Greeks, and they saw the story of Zeus and Typhon, and they borrowed it yet again. And sometimes it's hard to see which one they're borrowing, because by the time they've learned the third one, they've still got pieces left over of the first 2 borrowings. And so, like in the book of Daniel, they clearly have bits and pieces from the Canaanites, the Babylonians, and the Greeks all mixed together. To me, that was like an English sentence that has the word thin and tenuous in the same sentence. And so this is just one of many examples I used of getting terminology, so I didn't just have to say they borrowed from them. I could actually be more clear about direct borrowing, multiple streams of borrowing, and different ways of talking about it.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me, so there's a criticism of, Christianity, and, where they say, the critics will point to this borrowing from other cultures, and they'll say, oh, look, like, Christianity is just an amalgamation of different mythological themes and mythemes and motifs, and it's it's just one big I don't know if they go as far to say it's a scam, but it's one. It's just Jesus is just Osiris, it's just the same kind of thing. But the Christians took all this stuff and repurposed it. How would you answer that? Because there is borrowing going on, but it's not.
Yeah, I mean there is, and you could even find, of course, Christians who would say you shouldn't celebrate Christmas; it's a pagan feast.
Right.
And I mean, I guess the Pilgrims didn't celebrate Christmas, and
right.
And what's your Christmas tree doing? That's not in Bethlehem. Yeah, I mean, they're borrowing all the time. Yes, Christianity is borrowing things, and Judaism was borrowing things before that. You have to be careful though, because it would be very easy to say everything is borrowed,
mm-hmm.
and to say, well, look, Zeus sleeps with all these women and has heroic children, and isn't that what happens with Mary and Jesus? And so I was trying to be very clear that I'm not just talking about everywhere there's a dragon, or anything that even remotely looks similar, and be very specific that in order to qualify, it has to have a lot of these myth themes.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to have all of them, but it's going to have a lot of them. I mean, as soon as I published this book, there's a scholar that I've kind of responded to who's at Harvard, and he said, "Oh, this is just a global myth. Every human has this. This goes all the way back to the original migration out of Africa." And I've read this scholar's work, and he says, "Oh, here's a dragon in Polynesia, and here's a dragon in the Aztecs," and but you have to really be very vague in order to make everything match.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to be really specific and say, I'm going to talk about a myth that has a lot of shared elements, and where I can prove that there's historical contact. I mean, that's the other thing.
Right.
So I have this whole chapter where where I'm suddenly talking about Japan. And,
that was cool. Yeah, I mean,
and my point. So what I found was, in order to answer this idea that, this is just a global myth and we all have the same myth, I wanted to find a very far away myth that I could say, look, it's exactly the same, but I can prove its historical contact. And I also wanted to find one that was really close, that is totally different.
Mm.
And so I looked at this myth out of Japan, where you have a very, very similar dragon slaying. I mean, there's so many similarities.
Right.
It's clearly related, but you can actually show historically how people came from Korea to this part of Japan, and how they came from Western China to Korea, and they were in fact the same people who are writing these myths in the Near East. And it's historically connected. And then I looked at this myth in Egypt that is absolutely completely different. And so, although there you would say, if anybody would have the same myth because we all have the same myth, it would be the Egyptians. But in fact, the Egyptian dragon slaying myth is completely different. And so I wanted to show you could have dragons. That doesn't mean it's the myth I'm talking about. And every case of the one I'm talking about, there's a historical connection that you can point to.
So why would that be important to establish that it's not a global myth? That this pattern of the fertility god, that's also the storm god, slaying the dragon, that's also the kind of related to the sea. Why would it be important to show that it's not global? Yeah,
I mean, in part, it's because once you get to that level of this is really the same as that. It's just so easy to demolish it. The whole argument becomes very flimsy. And I think my argument is pretty tight because of the fact that it's always the storm god. The storm god is always a bull. The sea is always the dragon. There's always an initial defeat. I mean, all of these elements repeat over and over and over again. it makes it harder to say you're just imagining all these connections. As soon as we start throwing in, the Aztec Quetzalcoatl, then it's very easy for people to say, this is in the eye of the beholder. You're imagining this, and I don't see it.
Yeah, you're making
so that was the
connections
main
right
reason.
there. Yeah, because if you have that historical, when the two groups of people meet, you can actually point to say, okay, here's where this influence. Here's where these two groups of people influenced each other. So I don't remember, how was the Egyptian story different? I don't quite remember from the book.
Yeah, I mean, you have a dragon that is sort of slain every day, and the dragon is not the dragon. I mean, the dragon doesn't have multiple heads. The dragon is not the sea. The dragon is not slain by the main god. The god that slays the dragon is not a storm god. I mean, all the other pieces are missing.
I see.
It is a example of a dragon that's bad that's killed by a god that's good. That's the only thing that it has in common. But other than that, it's totally different.
Yeah. Okay. So why? I guess I'll reference one of my questions that I have in bold here. So with these these pagan myths, why is it important for Christians to learn about these, like the myth of Indra, or Baal or Baal, or however you pronounce it? Why is that valuable for understanding Scripture?
Yeah, I mean, the immediate ancestor, I think, is important because when we get to these passages where let me just see if I can find one quickly, where you've got God. Psalm 68 is a good example where you get, actually, let me get you a better one. 72 is probably the best one. God is my king from old, working salvation from the midst of the earth. You broke the sea by your might, shattering the heads of the dragons on the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, plural heads, singular Leviathan. I mean, anybody that reads that is going to say, what in the world is this? I mean, when did God crush a multi-headed beast? And so you really have to know, where are they getting this term Leviathan? Where are they getting God defeating this sea serpent? And the answer is not that they ever thought this was a thing that God did and that this was an animal, but that they mean something about it, and the context is the verse that starts it. God is my king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. They mean God is reliable in fighting evil and when things are going wrong, which I think is exactly what the Canaanites meant by it. So if the Canaanites have a myth that says our god Baal defeated a multi-headed sea dragon named Leviathan, same name, they also mean our God is reliable and you can trust him to overcome evil. I mean, they also don't think this is about history or marine biology. But the Israelites are sort of saying, whatever you mean by that on a sort of moral level, it's not true of your God, it's true of our God.
Yeah.
And so it's a pushback. And this is the main way they use this, is it's a pushback. Now, eventually, they take a different strategy. And you do have a couple of passages, like in Psalm 104, where God says, I created Leviathan to play with. So they're kind of saying, whatever you foreigners mean when you say your God defeated the dragon, it wasn't even a fight for our God. In fact, he plays with it. He takes it around on a leash and lets it.
It's a guppy.
It's like a guppy.
Yeah.
And so you see that strategy a couple of places. It's also in Job that way. But most of the time, it's this other method. Whatever you mean, it's not your God, it's our God. But to know what you mean, you really have to sort of see where this is coming from. Now, you don't necessarily need to see where it was coming from before Baal. But that's where this got interesting to me, because I had seen people write, oh, this was already a myth that the Canaanites borrowed. But nobody had ever really delved into that in detail. And that's where this just kept going further and further back in time. And by connecting it to this myth in India, and knowing how human migrations worked in the ancient world, where I was able to push this myth all the way back to like 8000 BC, that's not as important for understanding the biblical passage. I mean, it's interesting to me because it means that these metaphors that are very powerful enough that they use them in the New Testament as well, have been around for a very long time, and have meant something to people for millennia. And the meaning is almost always the same. So the meaning for the people of India is the same thing, that this God is trustworthy and reliable when things are going bad.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I liked that. It's something I've heard before too. What you say of Baal is actually true of our God. It's like whatever Baal has done, and like with the pagan gods, the mighty deeds they did, or were said to have done, were difficult for them. Like they almost don't win against the dragon.
Right.
Whereas the God of Israel, the true God, wins easily.
Yeah,
it's not even a challenge.
I mean, even Zeus in Typhon, Zeus ends up with his eyes, I think, temporarily taken away, and Hermes has to come and rescue him. And I mean, the only other example where it's easy is the Babylonian example, and that's because they associated their god Marduk with the emperor, and this was imperial propaganda as well. I mean,
right.
There's also a political element here.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. So I guess another general question: did these gods exist? Like, were they actual principalities? Because obviously, you have in the Old Testament, you have prophets fighting the prophets of Israel fighting the prophets of Baal. And when the prophets of Baal call down, call up to Baal for help, Baal doesn't help. And, so I know some people might not think that they existed, but would it be fair to say they existed, but they were demons?
Well, I mean, the Old Testament authors don't go that route usually.
Yeah.
I mean, they're much more like in that story you're talking about. I mean, Elijah just mocks them for the fact that Baal can't do anything.
Right.
And there's certainly a lot of other places where they say, a guy cuts down a tree and half of it he warms himself, and with the other half he bows down and prays to it. So, but the interesting thing is they don't do that with the bad guys, with the dragon. So do they think the dragon is real? And in a sense, I think they do. And I think maybe at some point I say that if the Israelites were to personify evil, they're not going to think of a red guy with a pitchfork and cloven feet and horns. I don't know where that image comes from. That's certainly not an image for evil that's anywhere in the Old Testament. They're going to think of a dragon automatically. For them, if you said personify evil, what does evil look like? It's not going to be a giant spider. It's going to be a dragon, because that's the thinking they've sort of been led to. So they don't ever, I mean, they might say on occasion, Leviathan is harmless and God considers it harmless, but they will never say it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
They'll say Baal doesn't exist and Marduk doesn't exist. And I mean, those things they'll sort of say don't exist. But the fact that there is real evil, they have a clearly clear concept of. And I think actually this is what is behind the serpent in the Garden of Eden story.
Yeah.
We think of it as a snake, but it doesn't actually crawl on its belly until the end of the
right.
of the story.
Why would it do something? Why would the curse be something it's always done?
Right. Yeah. So in a sense, although that's not usually considered to be part of the uses of this myth, I treat it because I think it is, and I think that's why it's a serpent. And not something else.
So why dragons then? Why identifying dragons with evil? I mean, because that's a trope that is.
I found that there's this whole field of study called monsterology,
mm-hmm.
where people have tried to unpack this, and these monsters there are things you can imagine but that you don't see. So it's a serpent, but it has legs, or it's a lizard, but it breathes fire, or it can fly. So you're mixing things that should not be mixed. And that kind of hybrid creature is the way most of the monsters of ancient mythology are. They're not depicted as, a giant cube that walks. I mean, they're animals that have been combined in new and unusual ways. Why it's specifically a dragon, I'm not sure, but that clearly goes way back.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this association of it being the sea, and that's there every time as well. Whether it's India, whether it's the Canaanites, whether it's this passage that I just read out of Psalm 72,
mm-hmm.
and there I think it's much easier to see. I mean, the sea, especially for the Israelites who are not a seafaring people, this is something terrifying. You don't know what's underneath it. It can quite suddenly turn stormy and wreck you. And you don't know where the other end of it is, and
mm-hmm.
it's just it's chaotic.
Right.
The waves come and go in chaotic ways, and so the idea of making it the sea that symbolizes, and for them chaos and evil go together.
Mm-hmm.
That one makes a lot of sense to me.
Right. Yeah, because God is, like order is good usually,
Right.
Too much of it could be a problem, but order is generally good, and chaos is bad. Like that makes a lot of sense. You can't have chaos, and the sea being identified with chaos makes sense too, as you were saying. And people now, I mean, I still, if you go out on a lake and you can't see the bottom, you get kind of nervous. It's
yeah.
At least I do.
Yeah, and this allowed me too to say, okay, well, what if we have all the myth themes except the dragon,
mm-hmm.
but we've got the sea? And so then when I look at the New Testament, and I'm not the first one to make this connection, I've got Revelation 12 where I have a dragon and it has 7 heads. Great. But the passages of Jesus walking on the sea, which are connected to the passages where he stills the storm
mm-hmm.
On the sea, there's a lot there that suggests this is actually a form of the same myth.
Yeah.
I mean, it says that he tramples on the sea, he rebukes the sea,
right.
The way he rebukes demons and the chapters around there.
That was interesting.
And so, yeah, I mean, yes, it's a lake you can see from one side to the other, but I think that doesn't change the fact that it still has all these other elements of chaos. And, here's this sort of sea trampling figure that's identified again as the divine warrior.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that part struck me, especially when, I think it was I don't know if it was you or somebody you're citing, but describing Christ like trampling the corpse of his slain foe, basically, where he descends a mountain, and then he walks on the water out to his disciples while they're fishing, and he's trampling the corpse of the dragon, of the sea, and that blew my mind because I don't think I'd ever made that connection.
I mean,
before.
If you combine it with the stilling of the sea, he tells the sea to be muzzled, which sort of implies that it was alive,
like an animal. Yeah, because you put a muzzle on a rabid dog,
Right.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. When you were going through the New Testament, that was because I had known a lot about the dragon mythology in the Near Eastern religions, but when you connected it to the New Testament and you started, pointing out patterns in the New Testament that people don't normally think about as dragon slaying, especially the Christ walking in the water and rebuking the sea. That was, I think that's when I knew, I'm like, okay, I gotta talk to this guy.
Yeah.
So
and they're interesting twists. I mean, there's a place in Romans where Paul says, God will crush Satan under your feet. Mm-hmm. And it almost is like his audience gets to become the dragon slayer. Because this crushing under the foot is something that's been there since the Old Testament texts.
Mm-hmm. Well, so let's go back to Genesis. When you were talking about how the dragon, when you're identifying the serpent, you're trying to go through what the serpent was, and it's not a snake, like it's not, and that's something that a lot of Christians, I think today, they think snakes are somehow evil. They don't like them because they're identified as a serpent in Genesis, but you are kind of connecting it to, no, it's a dragon. It's actually a dragon that's trying to almost even seduce Eve and cause them to sin. And
I mean, I wouldn't say to seduce Eve. Mm-hmm. And there's clearly two things going on there, and they want you to think of it both as they don't want the reader to just take out the serpent and put in evil, Satan, the devil, because there's a lot in the story that revolves around having just told the people to have dominion over the beasts of the field, mm-hmm. and then introduce this, and it explicitly says the serpent, which is one of the beasts of the field. So the reader's supposed to know, in other words, you can give it orders, not you can take orders from it. Mm. But at the same time, they could have made it a spider, they could have made it an owl, and the reason they make it a dragon or a serpent with legs is because there is no other possible image for personified opposition to God. So it's kind of both, and it's both an animal, but it's a specific animal for a good reason.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So your book is called The Dragon, the Mountain, and the Nations. So we've kind of talked about the dragon. What about the mountain?
So in all of these myths, after the dragon is finally defeated, there is a feast where the gods gather and celebrate the enthronement of the victorious god on a mountain. So that's in the Indian material. It's in the Canaanite, the Babylonian, and so forth. And in the texts in the Psalms, the mountain becomes Zion. It becomes Mount Zion, where the temple sits. In fact, there's one passage where they even refer to Mount Zion by the name of the mountain out of the Canaanite myth, Zaphon. Zaphon is a mountain that sits up on the Syrian-Turkish border, and
it's Baal's mountain, right?
Right. Yep. It's the mountain that Baal gets at the end.
Right.
And you get this, and although I'm drawing a blank as to which psalm it is, but you get this, it's in 89, but it's also in, it's in another one as well, where it refers to the psalm, or refers to Zion, Mount Zion, which is actually not really a very high mountain, as a Zaphon. It's here in 48, in Psalm 48. Mount Zion, the heights of Zaphon. I mean, this would be like saying calling it an Olympus.
Right.
Because their neighbors know it as, as the mountain home of the gods. And so the mountain becomes then an important part as well. And in the New Testament, you get images, the mountain is tied closely to the nations, because obviously in the Old Testament, you can't have all the gods get together and celebrate on the mountain. So instead, the mountain becomes a place where all the nations come together to worship God. If not now, then someday.
Yeah.
And so all of these Psalms that talk about Zion predict one day all the nations will come to this mountain of Zion. And that's picked up in the New Testament as well, about all the nations coming together in Christianity, as opposed to coming to the temple in Jerusalem. But it's the same sort of mountain and nations imagery. There are no nations in the foreign myths. The nations in the Israelite myth and in the New Testament take the place of the assembly of gods in all these other myths.
Yeah. Okay. They're in the pagan myths. You had said that they can double as like imperial propaganda. So they're not going to be necessarily. Well, I guess in the Romans they would conquer people and they'd say, well, now you're part of our, so there'd be this kind of false gathering of the nations in these other myths, but it's more like tied to conquering and like almost like propaganda from these other pagan myths.
and there are places where it sort of seems like propaganda in the Israelite sense as well. In other words, there are places where God's representative on earth of dragon slaying is the king, the son of David, who sits on the throne in Jerusalem. But interestingly, the place you get the most of that, the most of God saying David is the one who will crush the serpent, is Psalm 89 in the first part, where it talks about God giving David this authority to, even to set his hand over the sea, which is definitely an allusion to the king suddenly being the divine victor. Mm-hmm. Except the second half of the psalm is, if all that was true, then how come the Babylonians destroyed our city and took the king's descendant off in chains and so forth? So you don't really get much of the propaganda in the sense of it actually serving a sitting king. Instead, you get it as sort of thrown back at God as how could you let this happen to the king when he was supposed to have been this delegate on earth?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because you look at pagan myths and they're always winning. They're always conquering, right? Even in historically we know that they would lose a battle, right? They would say, oh yes, we're, victorious. Whereas the ancient Israelites were constantly losing because they are usually they're disobedient to God. And so they would,
and the more powerful the nation is that has the myth, the more the easier it is for their God to actually be victorious.
Right.
So, which is why the Babylonian Empire has the easiest dragon slaying.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't make that connection. Really, really interesting. So let's see. We talked about. Yeah, so why the Psalms specifically? Why is this imagery so prominent in the Psalms? Because you focus a lot on the Psalms in your book, more than the other parts of the Old Testament, although they're in there. But the Psalms have a lot of this dragon slaying imagery, and why is that?
Yeah, I think it's because that this is poetry, and that poetry is where you're going to pull out metaphors, and so it's and where you don't have to be literal. Our God is a fortress. Well, not literally. He's not actually, a citadel of bricks, but we know what it means. And so they are able to use metaphors here in a way that it, they do it in Genesis, but Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 are also what I would call myth. In other words, they're a narrative set in hoary antiquity that's been handed down and is really about philosophy. You're not going to see this in a history book like Chronicles or Kings or something like that. You're not going to see it in I was actually surprised to see it come up in the Gospels in the setting of Jesus on the water.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of symbolic acts that take place, turning water to wine and things like this. So it kind of fits the symbolism there. But the reason you have the most of it in the Psalms is precisely because this is poetry, and this is where you need metaphor, and they're happy to use these metaphors.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I have this appendix in the back where I talked about these images being reused by various other modern religions. And one of the things I mentioned in there is Rastafarianism, because reggae music uses the image of Zion, but in particular, the Zion that is not like a physical location where a king happened to live, but the Zion as the place that all the nations will come and so forth. So it just lends itself to song, like the Psalms.
Yeah, that makes sense. The dragon slaying, another difference, and correct me if I'm wrong, another difference between the two, like the Israelite and Christian use of the myth and then the pagan use of the myth, is that for the Christians, it's at the beginning and the end of time, right? It's not just now, but it's at the end with Christians, where the serpent comes into the garden, and then there's this promise, that her heel will crush the head of the serpent, but not yet, basically. And we want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I sort of argued that this is the initial defeat. Every other case I had of this myth, I had the storm god initially defeated. And there's certainly no example of that. Any place in the Old Testament that it says God is, crushing the heads of the dragon. And sometimes it's past, like Psalm 72 that I just read. Sometimes it is already projected into the future, like in Isaiah, where it's, on that last day, this will happen. But then I said, well, the serpent kind of wins in Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. And although it's not a confrontation actually at all with God, there's no conflict there. In a certain sense, you could see this as a defeat. And then on the other hand, if I think about this in terms of Jesus being the one that walks on water, actually he does get killed. So he doesn't stay that way. But you could again say, looks like an initial defeat to me. So I wanted to say, in a certain sense, it's no contest for God the way it was so difficult for all these other gods. But in another sense, you still have casualties on the good side in the biblical tradition.
You still have the
whether you're talking about Genesis 3 or whether you're talking about the crucifixion. So that's still there.
Right. Yeah, that's the initial defeat. It's that motif or that myth. The myth theme still kind of plays out in the gospel, even though it's still for God. It's nothing. Like he can. With Leviathan is nothing still. It's a really, it's a really interesting, I don't know if I'd say tension, but there's something there that's kind of, it's a mystery. It's kind of a mystery, I think I think that's something to kind of contemplate.
And I also want to add that the Israelites sometimes envision this myth as sort of erupting into history as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll use this imagery to talk about the crossing of the Red Sea as well. And, in fact, there's one of the Psalms where, you're talking about God crushing crushing the sea and defeating the serpent, and then suddenly it uses the images of the Israelites passing through the sea on dry land in the time of Moses. And so it's almost like they see a way in which what's a sort of cosmic thing, like it sometimes has a historical iteration as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something at the end you point out. We can talk about this in a little bit, but this, what are these things going to be next? What's the dragon going to be next? In Scripture, and kind of we'll get to this, but you're kind of critiquing the salvation history model of kind of catechesis.
Yeah.
So let's see the. Something I thought was really cool that when I shared this with my friends and stuff, and I thought it was just super cool. When in St. Luke, when St. Luke references the Virgin Mary, he says, "Blessed among women," and you had a note in here that says that phrase "blessed among women" actually refers to female assassons. And then you said, Can you talk about that more? I want more information on that.
The way I got into so when the dragon appears in the New Testament, clearest is Revelation 12.
Mm-hmm.
It's got 7 heads, and the author explicitly says this is the same one as in Eden. So it makes the explicit connection.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a lot that's drawn from the Typhon as well there. But the confrontation there is with this image of a woman that probably stands for the church. But at the same time, Christians from a very early period have seen this woman in a certain sense as also Mary, because it says the woman is pregnant and about to give birth to the Messianic King, to the Messiah. Now, obviously, this is not how it happens in Bethlehem, but this is kind of a mythic overview of it. And in fact, I even used in the book a photo that I took in this. There's a massive basilica next to where I teach, and it has an image of a 7-headed dragon confronting the Virgin Mary. But I thought, there are women in all these other myths as well. So in most of the dragon slaying myths, the storm god requires assistance from a goddess. Baal needs assistance from his sister Anat. Indra in India needs assistance from a female goddess. There are multiple other examples, not the Babylonian one, but all the rest of them. There's a woman that's a female that's instrumental in the defeat. And we also had this mention that you already brought up at the end of Genesis 3 that says from now on there's going to be this opposition between the woman and the serpent, and between this woman's offspring and the serpent. And so, what's this role of the woman? And I thought maybe this is connected in a certain way. And so I did mention that there is this title, Blessed Among Women, that is used in Luke 1:42, and you get this phrase twice. Once for Jael, who in the book of Judges assassinates a Canaanite general by cutting his head off. No, by pounding his head into the ground with a tent peg.
Yeah, that's what it is.
And then the other one is in Judith, which is a book that's not in the Jewish canon, but it's in. It was a very early Jewish book that was very popular and gets into the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox canon. And there, the blessed among women is this woman who assassinates a Babylonian general by cutting his head off. So you have two female assassins, both of whom seduce their victim, which is what the female does in the Baal myth and in the Indian myth and so forth. And in both cases, they assassinate the head.
Yeah, they strike
which
at the
is
head.
exactly what you had referenced in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
So I just sort of threw this out here, and I say, dare we suggest that if Jael and Judith are for retrospective readers, so-called types of Mary, that Anat is as well. I don't think anybody else has ever said Anat. If you studied Anat, it's like the last person you would want to associate with the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
Because she's like really vicious, bloodthirsty.
Yeah.
But, so is Jael and Judith.
Yeah, that was quite provocative.
Yeah.
There's definitely something there. I don't know if she'd be a type, but maybe there's something that kind of brings me to my kind of one of the biggest questions that I have is there anything? So what accounts for the similarity between these pagan myths, and then we got the Old Testament and New Testament, all these patterns, and there's a lot of similarities. And there's borrowing that's going back and forth, but they came from somewhere. And in your book, you didn't set out to go and find the myth, the original myth, right? But is this something that, I mean, as Christians, we in the Book of Revelation, it does kind of set up this cosmic pattern. With these pagans, are they kind of seeing that pattern, but it's distorted? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they've got this idea that, and late in the book I say that in a way this is a way of dealing with the philosophical question of evil.
Yeah.
If there's God that's powerful and good, why are there bad things that happen to good people? And you can either say, somehow he wants this to happen and I don't know why, or you can say, well, we don't know exactly, but he's on your side.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the answer everyone's coming up with, because the Canaanites are asking that same question. The people in India are asking that same question. Why is there suffering in the world, even to people who don't, do things that are wicked?
Yeah.
Well, there is this sort of cosmic conflict. There are powers opposed to goodness, and your God, whether it's Baal or Marduk or Indra, is on your side fighting against them. Israel's not saying you've got it all messed up. They're saying you got the name wrong, except for the few places where they sort of make it, where they make the dragon a guppy. Then they're sort of saying that, God is much more powerful than even that, and it's much more mysterious than that. But that's not the main thrust. I mean, I have way more texts from the Old Testament where it's this battle.
Yeah.
And so they're really not critiquing the theology of their neighbors. They're critiquing which God is involved.
Right. Yeah. It's not what you say is true of Baal is actually true of the God of Israel. Yeah.
Now, in the case of Baal, it's actually unusually difficult for Baal. So while the Babylonian example is unusually easy, the Canaanite example is unusually hard. And I don't even know why. And people suggested different readings. But, part of the issue is that in many of these cases, they don't want it to end definitive, because that would suggest that there's no more suffering now. Right. And so even in the Indian examples, there's sort of always this threat that the dragon may come back. and you're never sure if it's completely dead.
Well, I think there's a difference between the Christian version or of this mythological pattern in because it takes place at the beginning and the end, so at the Eschaton too. Because I think with the pagan myths, it's always in the past. That's what it seems like. I mean, you just mentioned that the dragon might come back, but it's always like, oh, this is something Marduk did, and for Christians, this is something that ultimately has happened and will happen still. It's already, but not yet. And so the dragon slaying has yet to be finished, and that happens at the end. And I think that was another striking difference that I found between the two, between the pagan mythology and the Christian mythology, is that kind of explains why there's still suffering and evil and stuff like that in the world now, because it's not done, it's not the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this makes me think of another issue that I sort of when I presented something about this verbally really early in the process of writing it, and some people jumped on me and said that this is the myth of redemptive violence, that that is underwritten Western culture, that we think that that you have to defeat evil in order to have good, but one of the points that I make is that one of the mythemes that goes with all of this is that war is abolished when the storm god is victorious. I mean, it's explicit already in some of the Psalms, and that's why the nations are able to sort of all come to Zion, because they're not all dead. They're precisely alive, but there's now peace with them. So I really didn't see this as part of redemptive violence, specifically once you've got this idea that it's an overthrow that leads to peace. Yeah.
Well, even so, going back to the New Testament as well, when you're talking about Christ, rebuking the waters and trampling the waters, I think you said in the next chapter, the next passage. Is that the miracle of the loaves and fishes? Is that when Christ feeds? Then he feeds people, right?
Yeah.
That's another.
Yeah, and that was
pattern.
Not my insight. I heard this at a conference, and I don't think this person ever wrote it out or published it. But so there you've got the banquet.
Yeah.
Immediately upon the feeding, depicted. Right. Yeah.
And so that's another part of the mythos too. Is that's why the storm god is also the fertility god, right? But they're the same thing, because the storm brings the rain, which brings the food. And interestingly, the dragon, I think it's in the Indian mythology, the dragon hoards water, right? So was it the Indian mythology, or is it?
Yeah, that's in India.
Yeah, the dragon hoards water, whereas in other Norse mythology, the dragon hoards gold, right? It sits on gold. But water is, it's precious for growing crops. And then when the dragon's defeated, then the flood, the waters are free, and then food is plentiful. Really fascinating stuff. So who is the dragon slayer in the Christian story? I mean, I think pretty obvious.
It certainly is identifying Jesus as the dragon slayer, but then it sort of moves beyond that when you've got these passages like Romans, where he says, God will crush Satan under your feet.
Yeah.
Where they're sort of extending, and even in, you have this passage in Genesis 3, where it talks about the enmity between the woman and the serpent, and between her offspring and the serpent. So it's sort of expansive. And I think there's a sense in the New Testament where in some ways they're making the Christians as a whole the nations, and in other sense they're sort of making them the dragon slayer.
Yeah, it's really that. I guess I didn't connect that when I read it the first time, but yeah, especially when you said that we're all called to slay the dragon. That's participating in Christ's nature, when we become saints. And it makes makes sense when you make that connection. That we're called to crush the head of the dragon with Christ, and
yeah, and I don't think I cited it in here, but I found like early baptism formulas that include in all these images where the water of baptism is the water of the dragon, and
wow.
and the person is coming out of the water victorious over the water.
Wow.
And I didn't cite them in here, but I did find some of these really early on from the first couple of centuries of Christianity.
Wow. Yeah, that's a little different than what we do. I mean, it's the same. We still use water, right? But we don't think about it in that way. Yeah, really. That's really interesting. And so you have the redemptive violence. The criticism of it. I don't know, because you talked about metaphor, and you talk about how the violence language is metaphorical, but it's still like Christ's has a sword coming out of his mouth, right? You still have scripture as the sword. So you can't get around like the violent metaphorical imagery. You can't just downplay that. It's part of it. And people want to, I don't know what the drive is to kind of reduce that that violence sort of language, but it's there. So you said that the sword, the Christ has a sword mouth, a sword coming out of his mouth, and Scripture as a sword invites the reader to think of Christ's words in terms of a conquering warrior, and to reason in these terms.
Yeah, I think I'm quoting somebody else there about who doesn't like it.
Still, it's still it's a good point. I mean, it's how we're supposed to be thinking about being a Christian. At least that's what I think. And not in like a weird, awkward way either. Not like, I mean, there are people out there who kind of go overboard with it, but it's still, the language is still there. It's still, crushing the head of the serpent is still part of the story, and you can't really get around that.
Yeah, in part, I understand where they're coming from. That if you could see this as justification for human violence, but it even in the only place where the humans are involved is like in that passage in Romans, mm-hmm. where but even there it doesn't say you will crush Satan under your feet. It says God will crush Satan under your feet, and it explicitly says the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet. So, I mean, as I said in one of the things, you can't enlist in God's army. That's so. The battle is not there is imagery of the Christian fighting a battle, but it's not this dragon slaying. The dragon slaying is happening on your behalf.
Yeah, right. And we're contending against powers and principalities and not flesh and blood. That's right. Also from St. Paul. So it's good to keep those things in mind, because misreading scripture it's always been a problem. And using it to justify all sorts of horrible things. But yeah, so going through, so any like thing you want to say about your book, before we talk about the theological implications of...
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go to that, because that was actually originally in the book.
Okay.
And the editors of this series made me take it out. And they said, we hope very much that Dr. Miller will publish this, but not here. Because, I mean, there's a lot of theology in this book, but they thought a little too theological. And so I took it out, and then I published it as a separate essay. But that was originally, somewhere before the conclusion, right? Like right in the last section of chapter 16. So there's a definite link there. And it is a sequel to the book in a sense. it isn't introduced that way. So I started in that article by sort of critiquing other ways that people try to unpack theology from the Bible that I'm worried about.
And the article's called
emphasis on history.
Right. The article is called "Dragon Myths and Biblical Theology," and it's published in Theological Studies. I just want to say that. Yep. Go ahead.
And so I started the article by noting this idea of salvation history, which was really a major trend in Protestant theology in the 1960s and 70s, and kind of died out. And now it's become a major trend in Catholic theology in the last 10 years. And I said it worried me for two reasons. The minor reason is, what do you do when archaeologists tell you these events didn't happen? But I thought the much more bigger reason is that there's all sorts of parts of the Bible that you can't fit into history.
Yeah.
I mean, there's really, if your theology is unpacking the mighty acts of God throughout history, then that leaves the Psalms completely out. And I realized that it's part of this sort of larger Western way of thinking, where we value history and science as that's the highest form of speaking. That's the highest form of discourse. And poetry, that's for pop songs and Valentine's cards. And people who write poetry, what do we think of people who write poetry? I mean, we don't think in those terms. Although, we love the Marvel Universe, and we love the Lord of the Rings, and we love mythology and mythic imagery, but it's entertainment. And to me, that seemed like you're going to miss an awful lot that way.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of recapture the ways in which myth, and I had written about this before. I wrote an article called Myth as Revelation that I published a few years even earlier, back in 2014. But I didn't give any examples. And so I wanted to say, okay, here's an example. We're going to take something that no one is going to deny this is a myth. So, if I start working with Genesis 3, I'm going to have some people say that's not a myth, and other people say that is a myth. If I say, God, you crushed the heads of Leviathan, nobody's going to question whether that's a myth.
Right.
And can I unpack theology from it? And so I tried there to build on this idea of the theology of the question of evil, and how does it address that, and in fact address it better than just speaking in sort of prose. That poetry and imagery actually helps you deal with these issues on a much deeper level.
Yeah. When I read that paper, I'd never really, because for me, the salvation model of history, or the salvation history model, it's been around since I came back. I came back to the church 5 or 6 years ago. So it's a little bit older than that. It's, 10 or maybe a little bit older than that in the Catholic world. And so for me, it was like, this is how you're supposed to view history, right? Or this is how you're supposed to view scripture, through this historical lens. But, if you start looking at, archaeologists who are they're looking at, okay, did these events actually happen? You said in your article that you're not denying necessarily that they're historical, but that's the wrong approach, because it can be, at least in the short term, debunked, I guess. That's the biggest weakness with that approach, is that, okay, well, I just there's no historical evidence for the existence of King David or something, so I'm not going to listen to you anymore. That's just silly to believe it. But then we learned about 100 years ago or so that everybody thought the Trojan War was a myth, and then now people are all in agreement usually that the Trojan War happened, and something like that happened. So it's you know, even if things get kind of quote unquote disproven now, you know, might get more evidence in the future. But it was an interesting critique because this kind of just avoids that whole debate. And you start looking at the mythic patterns in scripture and not necessarily, okay, did this literally happen? You know, and in some cases, yes, like, you know, the Jews were enslaved by Egypt and all, you know, but yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, and the idea, and I've seen a lot of these like curriculums and things with the big timelines and so forth, and then it's like, well, where's Psalms? Well, you know, David writes them and they're here, but no, where's the content of Psalms? It's nowhere because you can't fit it into that model.
Yeah,
I mean, nothing happens, and so I thought, we're in trouble here. We need more. And I'm not saying we don't need history. In fact, I say that the Nicene Creed is a historical narrative.
Right.
This happened, that happened, this happened. But it doesn't. It would be giving you just sort of a real small slice of what's in the biblical text.
It's an incomplete
with
picture.
No room for the Song of Songs, with no room
Right.
for the Psalms, with no room for Proverbs, with no room for anything that doesn't have a storyline to it.
Right. Yeah. I just keep thinking about like Jeff Cavins, you know, and he's one of the big, you know, and like he does really good work, and you know, it's fantastic. But yeah, it's when you pointed that out, I'm like, yeah, that's totally true. Like these poetic books of the Bible, like they don't really have a place in this model, and they're some of the most profound passages of scripture. You know, you have to have a way to fit that in, and it's just, it makes me think that, yeah, I think what you were saying, this almost, I don't want to say materialistic, but this almost materialistic approach to catechesis and to our own faith that has kind of crept in without us really realizing it, where we're saying, okay, yes, history is good, but it's not, you know, there's more than just the historical record, right? That's like, that's not, and like view science as the highest form of knowledge, and it's not, you know. Yeah, that article made me think a lot about kind of how we teach people about the faith and catechesis. Because at the end, I think you talked about how, you know, we should be asking when we're reading scripture, what's the dragon going to be now? You know, how are these patterns going to play out in this story? You know, in this book of the Bible. So really, really interesting stuff.
I mean, I'd say they don't ask what happens next because they already know the dragon's defeated. But the question is, what's the next dragon?
Right. I think you end it with this quote from Andy Angel.
Andy Angel, yeah.
Angel. No two dragons are the same. Some are dead, some are subdued, and others are very much alive and kicking. We are invited not only to sketch, but also to color in our own dragons so that they reflect our own sufferings and challenges. The myth can be molded to fit our realities, and yet the expectation that the story will finally break the mold when suffering is past.
Right.
Yeah. And then you had a quote in here, Christian truth is always embodied in poetry and myth. So that's...
Yeah, I mean, it's always... I mean, that's why we always have these symbols. You know, the why baptism in water. You know, there's always something that stands for something else.
Right.
And, you know, as soon as you say, well, in baptism we die with Christ. I mean, that's myth in a sense.
Yeah.
That's not literally happening. You know, so what is literally happening is stands for something else. And this goes back to my short definition of the myth, to say in the terms of the world what's beyond the world.
Yeah.
Not
when you said that, I didn't quite understand it, but now I have a better idea, especially in terms of baptism, because you're literally just you're just pouring water on usually a baby.
Right.
You know, that's what you're literally doing, but it's doing something, you know, in terms of the world, but beyond the world. You know, it's putting that indelible mark on the soul, and it's you're emerging from the defeat of the dragon, which is a very cool way to think about baptism. Yeah. Do you have anything else? I mean, this is a fascinating book, and everybody should go buy it.
I mean,
Yeah.
it takes you all over the place,
Yeah.
and I have, so that you have to be prepared. You're going to be in Japan. You're going to be.
Well, and a lot of
and it took me all over the place. I mean, literally, in the research for this took years, and I went to India for some of this, and
oh wow,
so I had no idea when I started this where this was all going to lead.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very, very good read. The last few chapters, I couldn't put it down. I was just, burning through it, especially, when you got to the New Testament and you're just like dropping all of these, like, oh yeah, when Christ is walking on the water, he's trampling the corpse of his enemy. Like, yeah, wow, really cool.
Well, and the nice thing there is the person who wrote the most about that is one of my colleagues here, Jack Heil,
okay,
who's now retired, but. He was the one who had first sort of argued that was behind those the symbolism there.
Yeah. What else? So I know you talked about the Aztecs, their story not really fitting, but it is interesting when you have like Our Lady of Guadalupe, that apparition was down in Mexico. She appears on a hill, on Tepeyac Hill, where they would perform. That was the ancient Aztec site, I think, of their goddess, who I think was depicted as a dragon, I think. And then, are you familiar with that at all? Or?
Well, I know that it's clearly building on the biblical imagery.
Yeah.
And then it's also drawing in the Aztec imagery. I mean, that to me is interesting. So I don't think there's a connection ahead of time.
Yeah.
But once you're talking imagery, it becomes much easier to bring in other images. And so, the fact that she's the moon that she's standing on, and I've seen this image unpacked before.
Yeah.
That it uses symbols that are being drawn from the Aztecs and melds them with the symbols that have been sort of already there.
Right.
Well, she's passed down.
Standing in front of she's blocking the sun, which is their god. They're the highest god, I think, for the Aztecs is the sun god. I don't know how to pronounce any of the names, but and she's standing on the moon, which is another deity. So she's more powerful than those two, and then all of the constellations on her robe, like they all map out to she has like Leo over her womb, or something like that. I don't quite remember, but the same sort of imagery, even though it's not related mythologically necessarily, historically, because there was no contact between the ancient Israelites and the Aztecs, as far as we know. But it's just interesting, the similarities, like with Our Lady of Guadalupe. So I was just wondering if you ever thought about that. Because that was a connection I made like last couple weeks ago.
The idea is that if your theology can be expressed in imagery and myth, then just as you can sort of explain things to a new culture, it actually is easier.
Yeah.
Because now you can say, okay, here's how it relates to your religion using your imagery.
Right. Yeah. Really. Yeah. It's really interesting. That's what I have. Do you have anything else? Want to conclude with anything?
No, this was great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, this was really fun. And what's in the future for you? Any interesting research you have you're working on now?
I've actually had a couple of books that have come out since this.
Okay.
And I'm sort of between projects right now.
I see.
When I'm no longer in administration, I'll have more time.
Yeah.
But this one I was working on this for 8 years.
Wow.
So this was not a short-term project.
Yeah, and it shows. Man, I went into it not knowing anything about comparative linguistics or anything like that. So those sections were difficult for me personally, just because I'm not familiar at all with it. But and how you kind of compare linguistics to how you use those the methodology of comparative linguistics to and utilizing that for comparative mythology, which is very interesting. But again, I didn't know anything about linguistics when I went into it, so I just knew some of the pagan stories, and again, a friend of mine recommended that your book, so I read it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm doing this podcast, and this isn't really about fiction, but it's about stories.
Yeah,
and it's about.
I think Tolkien comes up a few times, and Charles Williams.
Yeah,
comes up a few times.
name dropped Charles Williams in your article. Yeah, and I reached out to him like, have you ever read Gene Wolfe or Tim Powers?
Yeah, actually, Tolkien is not in the book, but Williams. I'm looking in the index. Williams is there 5 times in the book, plus in the article.
That's great. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of I Might Believe in Fairies. Please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow me on Twitter at Aaron Erber and like me on Facebook. If you're excited to see where the podcast is going and want to offer some support for the project, you can find me on Patreon. Music is by Alexander Nakarada, and podcast art was designed by my wonderful sister-in-law, Linnea Kisby. Until next time, talk to you soon.